Hey, I'm Lee Wright. I'm the founder of History Camp, and usually at this time I introduce Carrie Lund, who's the person who's put together the entire Thursday night series of fabulous authors. She is behind the scenes tonight and won't be joining us in person. She'll be back next week. And with us tonight is Louis Picone. He is a member of the Authors Guild, Mensa International, American Historical Association. He's a trustee on the board of the Grover Cleveland Birthplace Memorial. He's spoken widely on the topic of presidences and the places we commemorate, including Morristown National Historical Park, James Garfield National Historical Site, and the International Conference, U.S. Presidents and Russian Rulers, which sounds fascinating, right? At the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. He's the award-winning author of several books, including the topic of our conversation tonight, Grant's Tomb, The Epic Death of Ulysses S. Grant, and the Making of an American Pantheon. Thank you for joining us, Louis.
Well, thank you for having me, Lee. I appreciate it.
Well, we all know about Grant, but I think it's useful. Let's kind of set the stage. Here we are, kind of toward the end of his life. Talk to us about what's going on.
Okay, so in the mid 1880s, Grant is probably the most popular person in America at this time. He's celebrated in the North. He was the victorious general in the Civil War. He was twice president of the United States of America, and he's also celebrated and beloved in the South too. He was the magnanimous victor of the Civil War that had treated the Confederate soldiers and Lee generously at Appomattox and really all throughout the war. As well, after he left the presidency, he traveled the globe for 2.5 years. He went all over Europe, Africa, Asia, and everywhere he went, he was treated like a hero. So he's really one of the most popular men in the world at this time. So he's really on top of the world. Going into 1884, Grant is living in New York City by this point. Ever since 1881, that's where he'd settled. And he's healthy and wealthy. But by the end of 1884, Grant is bankrupt and mortally ill. So in May, Grant had fallen victim to what we now call a Ponzi scheme, or maybe a Bernie Madoff scheme, that he had lost pretty much all of his money. Not only that, he had fallen deeply in debt in the process, about $150,000 in debt. Just several months later, he was diagnosed with inoperable throat and tongue cancer. And in 1884, a cancer diagnosis was pretty much a death sentence. So that was Grant's year by this point. And then, so Grant is now faced with a difficult forecast. He knows he doesn't have much time left, and he's bankrupt, and he doesn't want to leave his family and his beloved Julia bankrupt and saddled with his debt after he's gone. So Grant then embarks upon his final battle to write his memoirs before time runs out for him, in an effort to gain financial security for his family.
And I think many of us are aware that his memoirs are considered the best presidential autobiography, I believe.
They are. It's not so much I'd say it's the best memoirs, best autobiography written by a president, because really it largely covers his Civil War years. There's very little of it that covers after the Civil War. He barely talks about his presidency at all, maybe just in passing. But Grant, who didn't consider himself a good writer, was reluctant to write his memoirs throughout his life. Publishers had been after him to do so. He never really needed to. But incredibly, he produces what is widely considered the best memoirs written by any president before or since.
So we talked about publishing, and so here he is in a situation where he very much needs the money to take care of his soon-to-be widow. And one of the other most famous people in the nation at the time steps in. Talk to us about this surprising publisher.
Yeah. So when Grant gets that diagnosis, when Grant's doctors tell him that he has cancer, the first thing that Grant does is leaves the doctor's office and goes to Century Publishing. Now, Grant had a relationship with Century Publishing in the previous several years. He had written small articles about individual Civil War battles for Century Publishing that had been published in Century Magazine. But they had been after him for years to write his memoirs. And by this point, Civil War memoirs had become somewhat of like a cottage industry where, and this is a generation after the Civil War now. So it's about 20 years after the Civil War. The North and South are still greatly divided in many respects. But Civil War memoirs are just this huge industry. Everywhere from privates to generals have been writing their memoirs. But Grant's the one they're all after. Grant's like the white whale. He's the one that all the publishing houses really want to publish their memoirs because he's the one that people want to hear from. He has the incredible stories. He's the victorious Civil War general. So Grant goes straight to Century Publishing and he tells them, I'm ready to write my memoirs. So they must have been shocked beyond belief. And they offer Grant a publishing contract. Fortunately, Grant doesn't sign on the dotted line. Grant takes the publishing contract, goes back home. And within a couple days, one of Grant's very good friends stops by to see him. And that is, I mentioned that Grant was perhaps the most famous man in America. Mark Twain stops by to see him, perhaps the second most popular man in America at this time. So Grant and Twain had developed this friendship over the years. A little bit interesting because Twain had served briefly in the Confederate Army during the Civil War, but Twain was just enamored with Grant, and at one point he had called himself Grant Intoxicated. So he had developed this friendship. He would stop by to see Grant when he was in New York City. So he'd stop by shortly after Grant had the contract, and Grant starts explaining to him what he's going to do. So Twain says, "Let me see the contract." And Century Publishing had basically offered Grant a contract that they would give any other author that came into the door, irregardless of Grant's stature, his prominence, and his selling potential. I like to joke around that if I was around in 1885, they pretty much, or 1884, they pretty much would have given Grant the same contract they'd given me. So Twain sees this and realizes that this is ridiculous. And it just so happens Twain happens to be starting his own publishing house at the time, Charles L. Webster. So Twain offers to him, "Let me publish your book. I will make sure that you get the best terms possible. I will give you the best terms possible and give you the best chance of gaining that financial security for Julia, for your wife, for the rest of her life." And Grant, a little bit reluctantly, agrees because he feels like he has this agreement with Century Publishing. He's a man of his word. Century Publishing ends up gaining in the process anyway because they publish some excerpts, so they make their money. So in the end, Charles L. Webster and Mark Twain's publishing company, the first book they ever publish is Huck Finn, Mark Twain's Huck Finn. The second book is Grant's memoirs. And just to slightly jump ahead, it becomes not just this fantastic, best regarded memoir by a president, it's also a best-selling book too. And Grant becomes a best-selling author after he's passed away, as well as a record-setting royalty earner, more than earning Julia the money that she needs to live comfortably for the rest of her life. We're slightly jumping ahead there, but
as I recall, and I need to check this, I believe that book was sold by subscription. Is that possible? And that
yes,
I'd read somewhere that many Civil War soldiers were kind of enlisted in selling that.
Yeah.
As I recall, it was he was in considerable distress toward the end of his life and still writing his memoirs. Is that correct?
Yeah. So Grant starts writing in November, and his health very quickly deteriorates. He's losing weight. He's struggling to eat. He's struggling to swallow. He's struggling to speak, and he's extremely uncomfortable as well. He's struggling to sleep too. He's depressed, and it's just very quickly he starts to deteriorate. But he becomes laser focused on writing this memoir, and he battles through the depression. He battles through the pain to work on the memoirs. When he gets to the point that he can't speak anymore because of the throat cancer, he starts writing notes, and the aides that are working with him are doing research, but this was all Grant's writing. And his doctors, after a while, they become concerned that the book is the only thing keeping Grant alive. Once he finishes the book, he's going to lose the will to live. So 1884 goes into 1885, and as we get into the summer of 1885, the summer heat in New York City is oppressive, and Grant is increasingly uncomfortable. His weight has dropped almost 100 pounds by this point, and his doctors suggest that he go to a different climate that might be therapeutic for him. So he relocates to upstate New York, to this cottage, Mount McGregor, that is just north of Saratoga Springs. And that's where he goes to complete the memoirs.
And then after he finally succumbs, talk to us about the funeral. It was quite an elaborate affair, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. And I should mention that Grant finishes the memoirs on July 19th. Grant dies on July 23rd. So just 4 days later is when he dies. So the funeral is held in New York City. And there were several cities that were vying for the honor of hosting Grant's funeral and ultimately building Grant's tomb. So in Grant's final days, he tries to share his thoughts about where he'd like to be buried. And he writes some notes to his family, but Julia is too distraught to think about it. She can't fathom life without her beloved Ulysses. So there isn't any decision made with Grant. But Grant gives several options. He discusses St. Louis, he mentions Illinois, and he mentions West Point, as well as New York City. And he references New York City because he said, during my final year, they expressed so much kindness to me. So ultimately, New York City is chosen, and they host for Grant the largest single funeral event that has been seen in American history up until that point. It's a 7-mile funeral procession that goes from Madison Square to the location of the tomb in Riverside Park. There's 60,000 marchers that include civic organizations, political organizations, fraternal organizations, as well as thousands and thousands and thousands of Union soldiers, as well as some Confederate soldiers too, because this really becomes a funeral, and the whole funeral, Grant's memoirs in some part, and Grant's tomb really become emblematic of the spirit of reunification and reconciliation that was so desperately needed at this time, because again, the country was greatly divided at this time, still 20 years after the Civil War. So about 1.5 million people flocked to New York City for the funeral, the largest funeral that's ever been held up until this point, the largest single funeral event. At the time, the population of New York is only about 1.2, 1.3 million. So it's just this massive event that's held in honor. And the slogan for the day, they almost become Grant's epitaph. It almost become Grant's final words, even though they weren't actually his final words, were Grant's campaign slogan of "Let us have peace." And all throughout speeches that were held that day and were held leading up to it, because churches and synagogues were all tailoring their services to Grant. Let us have peace could be seen all over the place, was mentioned. It was on banners. People strung it from their home, those words. So it really became the slogan for the funeral as well as for Grant's tomb.
Now, by virtue of securing the funeral, was it then determined that it would definitely be in New York, or was there some competition, as it were, after that?
Yeah, there was competition. There was several reasons why New York City was chosen. So Grant had given those 4 options, but as well, Philadelphia was vying for the honor. Arlington Cemetery, the old soldiers' home in Washington, D.C., that was like Lincoln's summer White House. So they were all vying for the honor for hosting Grant's tomb, for being the location. The family ultimately chose New York City for 3 reasons. One was because Julia still lived in New York City, so it would be close to her. She can go visit the site of her husband's burial place. Number 2 was the mayor of New York City. Mayor William Grace was extremely aggressive in securing the location. He had seen this as a great honor, as a great tourist boom. So he was very aggressive. And on the day that Grant died, he sent a telegram to Julia offering his city and offering to take the family. They can choose wherever they want. He'd take them on a tour of all different locations, but ultimately they can choose. But the third and most important reason was the one thing that Grant was adamant about. He let the family choose a location, but the one thing that he was adamant about was Julia needed to rest by his side. And Julia was adamant about it well. So while much of the nation outside of New York City felt New York City was the wrong choice, that Grant was a national hero and Grant should be on national ground, such as West Point, such as Old Soldiers Home, or Arlington Cemetery, all those locations had regulations that they were for military only, and spouses couldn't be buried beside their husband. So that ruled out all those locations. So in addition to being aggressive, the mayor guaranteed Julia can be by your side, and plus we're going to build this magnificent Gilded Age tomb that's fitting for Grant, but also just fitting for the era, fitting for the Gilded Age, this era of massive architecture and over the top architecture. So that was the reason.
And then tell us about the process of selecting the site, the architect, and ultimately getting the tomb built.
Yeah, it was a long slog. So it took about 12 years to finally build the tomb. The location was chosen. As promised, the mayor took the family, took Fred Grant, the son, was kind of the designee by the family, took him on a tour of all different locations. Everyone thought, all right, if it's going to be New York City, it's got to be Central Park. Grant loved going in Central Park. Central Park was this beautiful park that seemed the best location where tourists would go, where the population would rest. But the mayor brought the family through Central Park, pointed out some locations, but kind of dissuaded them from Central Park, saying that any tomb would have to fit into the landscape here. But let me take you to Riverside Park. This is a new park, way north, and there the architect is going to have carte blanche. It's a blank slate, and the reason that it was a blank slate was because it was well north of any of the social, the economic, the tourist activity, the population. It was at 122nd Street is where they ultimately built it. But at the time, one critic said that there's more goats than people up there. Because you have to remember, just 140 years ago, New York was much different than it was today. Most of the population was downtown. Every decade, it seemed the population moved a couple streets further and further north. It was growing very rapidly, but it hadn't grown to that point yet. And the location is on the outskirts of Harlem. It's in this area called Morningside Heights. And it was mostly small little hamlets and villages and farmland and roaming wildlife. grazing. So it was much different from what it was today, or from what it is today. But the reason that the mayor wanted that is because he wanted a draw for the social and economic and tourist activity to really, as it was going further and further north, he kind of felt this will draw it even further north. Never really happened that way. So right away, Mayor Grace forms the Grant Monument Association, pulls together Gilded Age elites to gather together to help make sure that this grand monument is built. And these are Gilded Age elites like former President Chester Arthur, who lived in New York City at the time, Politico's Roscoe Conklin, who was the boss of the Republican Party at the time, J.P. Morgan, John Jacob Astor, Cornelius Vanderbilt, really the Gilded Age elites at the time, some like the robber barons at the time, pulled them together to use their influence and use their sway to help build this great monument. The design, there's several failed design competitions. It kind of gets a strong start, but then starts to nosedive pretty quickly. The big thing they have to do is fundraising. So within the first month, there's plenty of funds coming in, and they raise this incredibly aggressive target of $1 million. To put this in perspective, Lincoln's tomb, which was the first of the Gilded Age tomb, cost about a quarter of that, about $250,000. James Garfield's tomb, which was the biggest tomb yet to be built for a former president, cost about $200,000. So $1 million was so astronomical, but they felt people love Grant, they'll donate the money. After the first month, these Gilded Age elites start to go about their other business because they're busy. They're establishing railroads and banks, and that's what they go back to doing. So their attention starts to shift away, as well as people's attention starts to shift, and the cacophony of calls to build this somewhere else starts to build, where New York City isn't the right place. There's other monuments being built that are vying for donors' funds, because at this point there wasn't even any statues of Grant that had been built. So all of a sudden, in Kansas and Philadelphia, in all different locations in Chicago, statues are being built. So people are sending their money there. Some of them are even called the Grant Monument Association. So people are confused. They don't even know where they're sending their money. So funds pretty quickly dry up. The design, again, is a slog. It takes about 4 or 5 failed attempts to finally get a design chosen, which is ultimately John Hemingway Duncan is the one that proposes the design. And then even after that, it's still 7 more years of going back to fundraising, because even when they choose a design, they only have enough money to build the base, which is basically like this square, unsightly base without the beautiful dome on top. So they need to double down on their fundraising efforts. They get new blood in the Grant Monument Association. There's builder strikes they need to deal with. There's congressional efforts to relocate Grant's body even after construction starts, because it's taken New York for so long. So finally, long story short, 1897, 12 years after Grant dies, Grant's tomb is dedicated.
Tell us a little bit about the dedication. We talked about the funeral and the 7-mile long procession. 12 years later, what was the public embrace of Grant?
Public response by 12 years later is just as strong for Grant as it was when he died. Thousands and thousands come to the funeral. Former President Grover Cleveland is at the funeral. William McKinley dedicates the tomb. By this point, the number of Union soldiers to Confederate soldiers is even kind of tilted even further. There's even more Confederate soldiers there than there were at the time. Even Jefferson Davis's widow is in the crowd, because she becomes friendly with Julia Grant in the intervening years. But one of the things about Grant's tomb is that it becomes incredibly popular with former Confederates, because it's just this site like Grant where reconciliation and reunification are celebrated. So it really, even the temporary tomb becomes this incredibly unique site where, I mean, I can't really think of any other locations where you have Union and Confederates both going to pay homage, as well as former enslaved individuals, men and women, Republicans, Democrats. Grant remains the one figure that can really tie the whole country together during this divided time.
Interesting. To what extent, by the way, were African Americans in attendance? Any sense?
As far as there was African American regiments that had marched in the procession. There was articles about African Americans that had joined. There was some that had spontaneously joined the original procession. That there was a gathering just that had just went to go view the funeral, that had felt so compelled they ended up marching in the funeral spontaneously. So African Americans did participate in both events.
Now, we talked about where the tomb was, in a sense, when it was placed there. After many, many years, New York was a different place, and kind of a tough place for that tomb, correct?
Mm-hmm. Correct. Yeah, starting in the, I'll even bring it back. Starting in in the early years of the 20th century, Grant's reputation starts to change. So Grant is this beloved hero. In the South, shortly after the Civil War, the lost cause ideology starts to form, where the Civil War wasn't fought over slavery and it was a righteous cause by the South. And that ideology starts to take hold in the North as well, going into the 20th century, into the teens and the 20s, and it just further and further gains steam. So as that lost cause ideology starts to rise and Robert E. Lee's stature starts to rise, Grant's goes in the opposite direction. So first you have Grant's reputation starting to fall and the Civil War generation dying off. So Grant's tomb at first, for the first 20 years, is a #1 tourist attraction in New York City, more than the Statue of Liberty. But that starts to fade. And going into the 50s and 60s, as Grant's reputation is now starting to nosedive, at the same time, New York City is starting to change too. And one of the things that I did is that I mapped out murder rates in New York City to visitation. And as New York City starts to become more dangerous in the 1960s, all throughout the city starts to become dangerous, but especially in this remote area on the outskirts of Harlem, in this park that few people are going to, it starts to transform. It starts to go downhill into the late 60s, really into the mid 1990s. Pretty much nobody's going to Grant's tomb anymore, and the area is more popular with gang members and criminals and prostitutes and homeless than tourists. And the tomb starts to become vandalized, where people are spray painting graffiti on it. Every morning, first there's liquor bottles that are strewn all about that need to be cleaned up. Soon it's drug paraphernalia that is found at the tomb. There's no bathroom at the tomb. There's no public bathroom. So you can imagine some people are using it as a bathroom. So they're not going inside the tomb. The tomb is locked. The tomb is secured. But the outskirts of the tomb are really getting pretty horrendous. There's just, it's almost like reporters are just trying to outdo themselves during this period. When you read the lurid descriptions about what they find there, as well as there's burnt out cars all along Riverside Drive in this part of the city. So as Grant's reputation goes downhill, New York City becomes a more dangerous place, and Grant's tomb just gets sucked right into this vortex.
And there was a turnaround though at one point, correct? And a particular individual took this upon himself, I believe.
There was, yeah. So by 1993, Grant's tomb hits a rock bottom. There's a day when workers come in, and every day they have to clean up. But now they look down and they see just really lurid paraphernalia. There's human waste. There's drugs. So they clean that all up. They look up and they see that someone hung a garbage pail from the flagpole. And it's almost like the pirate dregs of society had commandeered Grant's tomb for themselves. So it's almost like there's this low point in 1993. Now, several years earlier, a man named Frank Scaturo, actually just a very young man at the time, had enrolled at Columbia University. And Columbia is just like a stone's throw away from Grant's tomb. Now, Frank, as a young boy, was very interested in the presidents and really drawn to Ulysses S. Grant. Someone he researched, someone even as a young boy felt deserved better by historians than he's gotten. Just by happenstance, he happens to enroll in law school at Columbia University, but Grant's tomb is nearby. So obviously, Frank's going to go visit Grant's tomb. And what he sees there horrifies him, just like it should anyone that went to go see Grant's tomb at the time. But Frank first starts hanging around the tomb, and he ends up giving tours. He ends up no one told him to give tours. He wasn't hired by the National Park Service, but because he's there so often, he starts giving tours. Eventually, he becomes a volunteer for the National Park Service, and he just digs himself into the archives, and what he finds even disturbs him further. That going back even decades before, many of the artifacts had been destroyed, had been willfully destroyed. Other artifacts like letters and photographs were placed in locations where they were damaged, water damage. Basically, they were destroyed through neglect. So Frank starts trying to work through the chain of command through his superiors at the National Park Service to raise awareness. Not that anyone that looked at Grant's tomb wasn't aware of what horrible conditions, but Frank is extremely persistent. And when he doesn't see any change, what he does is that he writes a 325-page report and starts mailing it and starts hand delivering it to anyone he can think of, including the mayor, the governor of New York, the Secretary of the Interior at the time, who was in charge of the National Park Service, and President Bill Clinton. So he just becomes so persistent. He ends up, the National Park Service become extremely annoyed at him that now they look at him as disregarding the chain of command, even though he tried to work through the chain of command. He ends up starting to get attention. First, a New York City television show broadcast their Sunday morning show from Grant's tomb, and they interview Frank. So he shows them Grant's tomb. Look at the litter, look at the graffiti, look at the weeds, look at the cracks. And by this point, nobody's really going to Grant's tomb, and there's not the internet, so it's really out of sight, out of mind for most of New York City at this time. So this really becomes the first time that people really see how bad it's gotten. Shortly after that, there's a New York Times article that's written about Grant's tomb, and this really becomes the flashpoint. It's only about 400 words, but it just starts setting off alarms with the National Park Service and really galvanizes public awareness for Grant's tomb, and that this is a site that's going to be lost if we don't do something about it. And I'll just say I've researched many presidential sites. I've researched birthplaces, I've researched graves, presidential libraries, homes, etc. Very rarely have I seen a single private individual do so much to save a very likely dire outcome. And if it wasn't for Frank, we might not have Grant's tomb to go to today. There's one other individual that I'd like to mention too, because I kind of look at Frank as the head of the effort to restore Grant's tomb. But I'd also like to mention who I think of as like the heart of restoring Grant's tomb, and that was Grant's great-great-grandson, Ulysses Grant Dietz. Because it's one thing, Frank, who's just a private individual who is clamoring about the need to save Grant's tomb, but he partners with Ulysses Grant Dietz, Grant's great-great-grandson. And now it's a little tougher to ignore Grant's family member saying, "Look at look at this grave. This is my great-great-grandfather. He deserves better." And what they do is that they partner together and they sue New York City. They sue New York, or I'm sorry, they sue the National Park Service to restore Grant's tomb, to live up to their obligation. As well, at the same time, there begins congressional efforts, just like there was back in the 1890s when it was taking New York City too long to build Grant's tomb. Now, once again, 100 years later, there's congressional efforts because people in Ohio, as well as most adamantly from Illinois. First, it starts out at the state level in Illinois, where there's efforts in Congress to, or in the state Senate, to have Grant's tomb relocated to Illinois. Their claim is that we're taking very good care of Lincoln's tomb here. What New York City is doing, what the National Park City is doing, is atrocious. Please relocate Grant's tomb here. Soon that goes from the state level to the Congress in Washington, D.C. So finally, with Frank's efforts, with Frank as the energy behind it and really causing this great turn of events, the National Park Service dedicates the badly needed funds to restore Grant's tomb. And I mentioned 1993 was really that low point when the people that worked there saw the garbage pail. They saw the waste down. Just 4 years later, by 1997, April 27, 1997, 100 years after the original dedication to the day, there's a rededication at Grant's tomb. The tomb has been restored. It's been cleaned. It's been secured. It's now a safe location to go visit. Now, at the same time, New York City is going through this metamorphosis where it becomes safer too. And during this period, murder rates that I think it peaked in like 93, 94 start to come down, or they peaked earlier, but they remained high up until those years. They start to come down. So there's just this synergy of events that by 1997, just 4 years after it looked like all was lost at Grant's tomb and it had turned into this national joke, it was now back like a phoenix from the ashes.
Well, I do have to ask about that joke, which as a young, as a child, you hear that and you're like, so why is that a joke? How did it ever come to be a joke?
Yeah, I almost can't believe that I haven't mentioned who's buried in Grant's tomb up until this point. But the joke, Groucho Marx was the one that made it famous. What's actually funny is that now when I mention that I've written a book about Grant's tomb, it's almost like knee-jerk. The first thing that many people say is, who's buried in Grant's tomb? But I can say many of the people don't even realize it's a joke. Some people are like, so who's buried in Grant's tomb? They ask me like a question, not a joke. And it just became so much part of the culture. This was in the 1950s that Groucho Marx uttered it on his TV show, first his radio show, then his TV show, You Bet Your Life. So Groucho Marx, everyone knows from the Marx Brothers, he was really like the reason that people were watching the show. They didn't care if people won or lost. They wanted to see Groucho Marx kind of like nicely, almost like making fun of his guests. And when the guest couldn't get anything right, he'd throw him like the softball. Well, who's buried in Grant's tomb? I'll give you $10 just to give you like this nice, easy question. Now, what I did find in my research was that Groucho Marx wasn't the first one to use that joke. I actually found Shirley Temple had used it about 2 decades earlier. But it really became part of the culture. And it just so happened that it was the 1950s, right when Grant's reputation was downhill. Shortly afterwards, Grant's tomb goes downhill. So it becomes more than just like an innocent joke. It almost becomes symbolic of this turning point where you almost couldn't imagine Grant's tomb being the punchline of a joke 50 years earlier. But now it's widely accepted. People can laugh about Grant and laugh about Grant's tomb. Not that, I mean, it's harmless, but
Sure.
what comes after it, it really becomes symbolic, where Grant's tomb now turns into a bad joke. And if you look at articles at the time, that's so widely used. Grant's tomb is now a bad joke.
Well, let me ask one last question, and then we'll go to questions from the audience.
Mm-hmm.
If people are in the area, should they make a point of going to visit?
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you asked that question, because since 1997, I mean, like I mentioned, the tomb is back, and people should definitely go out of their way, because it's still a little bit out of the tourist attractions. You go to New York City, you go to Times Square, you go to Broadway, you're not going to be anywhere near Grant's tomb. So I recommend going out of your way to go see Grant's tomb. One, it's this magnificent. I didn't even mention it's the largest tomb in America. So even before or since, this is the greatest tomb in America. It's 150 feet tall. It's 8,000 cubic feet. Nothing like this had ever been built before. It was a #1 fundraising effort, public fundraising effort. 90,000 people donated over $600,000 to build Grant's tomb. So it's just this magnificent period piece of Gilded Age architecture. As well as just, it's a heck of a fascinating story too that went into building Grant's tomb. Sometimes you look at architecture, or you look at buildings, you kind of think oh, they've been there forever, and but knowing the story of Grant's tomb just makes it all the more fascinating. And then knowing just Grant's history and how the tomb was so symbolic of the "let us have peace" and just reconciliation, and I think that message resonates still more today, or even more so today than it has in recent years.
Well, very interesting. So let's get questions from the audience. Before we do, though, let me mention July 10, History Camp America. So I hope that everyone who's watching tonight has gotten a piece of email or seen some information about this. This is the first time we've ever done a History Camp America. It is online. There'll be more than 25 sessions, 7 behind-the-scenes tours of historic sites. And if you've had a chance to go to the in-person history camps that we've had in Boston and elsewhere, you know how much fun they are. And if you've not had a chance, this is a great opportunity. No need to drive, no need to fly. And we're doing it in a way so that if you get one registration, that covers you and your family. Right now, register, and you not only get that, you save $30. And then there's also, and this is new too, a box of history swag. And it's the exclusive History Camp America 2021 box, and it's a bunch of fun. So go to historycamp.org/register. You can read all about it, and really hope folks check it out. Okay, so let me actually go to one of the things you mentioned just in passing. You said that Grant liked visiting Central Park. Now, this is a question that's a little bit away from the tomb. How does a famous person in America, one of the most famous person in America, stroll through Central Park in the days before the Secret Service and so forth?
Yeah.
Any sense of that?
Yes. So Grant only lived, again, just a stone's throw from Central Park. He lived in a brownstone on 66th Street, just like a block from Central Park. So he would frequently go to Central Park, sometimes on carriage rides, sometimes to walk through Central Park. Now, in the early years of Central Park, it was almost seen as a place for the elites to go to, because many of the rich lived that far north by Central Park. The less fortunate, lower economic would be downtown in the tenement building, so they wouldn't as much frequent Central Park. But over the years, it became more of this democratic space. I mean, it was always open to all classes, but now many more classes would go there. So there wasn't so much, even though Grant was the most famous person in America at the time. I mean, like you mentioned, there wasn't Secret Service, and I think in general, people would respect his space. But of course, one of the things that Grant liked doing too was going to meet people in Central Park. So I think it was nice enough where he could enjoy meeting people, but it wasn't like this massive crowd around him that he couldn't move.
Yeah, how interesting. It's, we look back at the pictures or the drawings rather of the White House with no fence and so forth, right?
Yeah.
Being able to walk.
Hard to believe.
Well, so we talked about Frank and what a remarkable individual. I think you probably have to be as young as he was to believe that one person could move the federal government to do what they ultimately did. Really, really remarkable. 328 pages, is that right? His report.
Yeah.
What is he doing today?
Well, one thing that Frank did in his effort to restore Grant's tomb is that he resurrected the Grant Monument Association. So, 1959, the Grant Monument Association turns over authority and ownership of the tomb to the National Park Service. The Grant Monument Association manages to survive another couple years, but by the early 60s, it also gets dissolved. So Frank resurrects the Grand Monument Association, and he's still active on the Grand Monument Association today. He's president. So he's still incredibly active and devoted to Grant's tomb. Since this time, he partners with the National Park Service. So the National Park Service, even though they were sued and during the tough years, they really weren't doing what they could, but they were also up against these incredible odds in this area of New York City. So they did incredible work to restore Grant's tomb, and they have since partnered with the Grant Monument Association and Frank, and they retain this partnership to this day to help maintain Grant's tomb, so it doesn't fall back to those horrible conditions that it did in the past. Yeah,
that is great. You've written a couple of other books. I want to touch on each one of those, and maybe we can have you back at some point, and we'll take a deeper dive. One of the books is about presidential birthplaces. Is that right? What are some perhaps less well-known presidential birthplaces that people should put on their list now that we're doing things like getting in cars and driving and visiting historic places?
Yeah. Well, if you go to Grant's tomb, you can go see Teddy Roosevelt's birthplace, which is also in Manhattan. Birthplaces are just fascinating to me. That was my first book. And they're fascinating because nobody cares about a birthplace until someone actually becomes famous. So for the presidents, this is like 50, 60 years later before anyone gains an interest in the birthplace. And by this point, a lot's changed with birthplaces. And I should mention that Jimmy Carter was the first president born in a home or born in a hospital. And every president born after Jimmy Carter was also born in a hospital. But before that, they were all born in homes. So many of these homes over the years have burned down. They've been just kind of like destroyed over time. They've fallen apart. Some have been relocated. They've been moved. And others, some people still lived in them. Like even today, John Tyler's birthplace, who was born in 1790. Someone still lives in this house. So you can go there and you can see a sign, John Tyler was born here, but you can't go inside. So yeah, they just kind of like run the gamut from real touristy attractions. National Park Services manage, so the National Park Service manages many of them. But many of them kind of have these quirky stories as 50, 60 years later, all of a sudden there was these efforts to recreate like George Washington's birthplace and Abraham Lincoln's birthplace. What you're looking at there isn't really the birthplace, but they just have these fascinating stories behind them of what you are looking at.
Yeah. I believe Hoover's birthplace, which I visited, what an extraordinarily modest house. Yeah. And here you have an individual who had the misfortune of having some horrible economic policies, but was actually very well educated. He and his wife, right? Stanford geologist, I believe, traveled to China, just extremely worldly. Again, from this very, very modest house. So let's then talk about the sequel, presidential tombs and so forth. We've talked about Grant's tomb, of course, tonight. What other notable ones would people be interested in seeing?
Mm-hmm. I mean, presidential tombs are also very emblematic of the area. They start to kind of, or emblematic of the era that they're being built. So the first tombs were very modest endeavors. Like George Washington's tomb is very modest compared to Grant's tomb, and he was intentional about that, where he didn't want a funeral, didn't want a grand tomb because he felt that was the Republican virtues. That we were much different from European dictators and monarchs, and some of these early tombs are so modest you wouldn't even recognize them. Like even like Martin Van Buren's, if you go to the cemetery in Kinderhook, you'd struggle to figure out which one is a president's tomb because it's smaller than some of the other gravestones that are there. But then after Lincoln, the assassination, and now we're in the Gilded Age, that's when you see just these massive tombs that become bigger and bolder and more audacious and really peak with Grant's tomb. They go all the way up to Warren G. Harding, who's kind of like the last president to die in the waning days of the Gilded Age. And right away they plan this massive tomb for him, which is beautiful. It's in Marion, Ohio. But meanwhile, quickly all the scandals came out. So by the time they come to dedicate it, Calvin Coolidge is president. He doesn't want to go to the dedication. So they ended up postponing it. And finally, Herbert Hoover goes as president, goes to the dedication.
I see.
So many of these tombs just have fascinating stories. But also you can see temporary tombs too. You can go see the temporary tomb of Warren G. Harding. When you go to McKinley, you can see the modest temporary tomb that he was in. And now pretty much most of them are buried in their presidential libraries.
Yeah.
That has become the standard now.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. We've learned about Grant's tomb. I think when I first learned about the book, I was interested in kind of what was the story behind it that would result in something that was book length, and it's certainly been an interesting evening. So thank you for joining us. Also, thank you, James and Edith Spain Foundation for supporting the pursuit of history and this discussion series. We have, by the way, a link to Lewis's book in the chat, and you'll be able to learn more about it. To find out how you can be a member, to join or donate to the Pursuit of History, go to thepursuitofhistory.org. And as I said earlier, History Camp Americas on July 10th. Registration is open. Register now. Save $30. Check it out at historycamp.org/register. Next week, May 6th, Tom Clavin will be joining us to talk about Daniel Boone and the fight for America's frontier. You may remember Tom talked to us earlier about his book about Tombstone, the shootout at the OK Corral. This will be another interesting talk from an excellent author. So thanks very much. Thanks again, Lewis.
Thank you, Lee.